Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a really fascinating dynamic to unpack today in the Australian political landscape. We're objectively looking at a recent Sky News broadcast that points to a massive, rapid surge of populist forces, specifically, the idea of one nation coming fast. We're going to break down exactly how this political squeeze is happening right now, who's losing ground, and what the commentators are identifying as the root causes behind this whole shift.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to look at one nation coming fast, the coalition's crisis, the appeal of Pauline Hanson, Labor's tax policy backflip, and finally, a playbook comparison.
So, Section 1, One Nation Coming Fast. The broadcast points to a recent Saturday by-election as a massive catalyst here, essentially a clear indicator of a major political shift.
Now, what's really interesting here is the primary vote. In that recent by-election, One Nation secured literally 3 times as many voters as the Liberal Party. 3 times! Commentators are emphasizing that you really can't underestimate this result. They didn't just win a by-election. This kind of massive multiplier suggests they've catapulted from being seen as a fringe party into a major populist force to be reckoned with.
And former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce confirmed this is absolutely not a fluke. This strong One Nation following is being validated in places like South Australia and Farah. In fact, the source notes that the bond between Pauline Hanson and Barnaby Joyce has never looked stronger. They were described as practically rapturous on election night, almost as if they'd won government themselves. It really underscores this sentiment that One Nation's momentum is incredibly real, and yeah, they are coming fast.
Moving to Section 2, the coalition's existential crisis. Because if One Nation is surging, well, someone's paying the price, right? Let's look at this existential threat to the Liberal and National parties. 21%. According to the analysis, it was a catastrophic mistake for the Liberals and Nationals to run separate candidates. It caused their combined primary vote to just absolutely plummet to 21%. Together, they might have had a fighting chance, but apart, they just bled support. The Nationals are now at risk of withering away entirely. The damage to the coalition here is pretty devastating. The Liberals are facing what's being called a brutal squeeze. They're losing their left flank to the Teals, while simultaneously conceding their conservative right flank to One Nation. They're literally being stripped of seats on both sides, which is shrinking the party into an ever narrower sliver of relevance. And it prompts a really unavoidable question. With this squeeze happening from both sides, what does the Liberal Party actually stand for today? Which brings us to Section 3, the appeal of Pauline Hanson. With these major parties fragmenting like this, why are voters specifically turning to her right now? Well, the broadcast argues her appeal comes down to a few key dynamics. First off, she's a high-profile, unmistakable leader. Pretty much every Australian knows her face. But fascinatingly, even though she is far from the most polished or articulate politician, and sure, she makes mistakes, these flaws are actually working for her. The commentators compare it to Donald Trump. Voters are interpreting these unpolished moments as genuine authenticity. Plus, Australians have absolutely no doubt about her unambiguous policy stances. With issues like terrorism and radical Islam front of mind for a lot of people, her strict anti-immigration position is heavily resonating with voters who are just actively searching for some certainty. Let's move to Section 4, Labor's tax policy backflip. You see, the coalition isn't the only one struggling here. We also need to look at the Albanese government's economic track record and some allegedly broken pledges. 50. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese previously ruled out making any changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax 50 separate times. 50. The source highlights a moment where a journalist from the Daily Telegraph actually confronted the Prime Minister directly, asking if, by changing these policies after ruling them out 50 times, he had lied to voters 50 times. It's a really stark representation of the broken election pledges that the analysis says are fueling some deep voter frustration. So the crucial point is the narrative friction here is just incredible. Prime Minister Albanese apparently drove this change himself during summer meetings, trying to justify the broken promise under the banner of intergenerational inequality. Minister Katie Gallagher even came out and stated, "I don't think he's given enough credit for having an appetite for reform." Think about that dynamic for a second. A government minister arguing they deserve recognition for executing a massive backflip on a policy they promised never to touch. When you put all of this together, you get a perfect storm of compounding voter frustrations. We're talking national security concerns, rising inflation, severe cost of living pressures, and now blatant broken election pledges. The broadcast suggests these perceived failures by the Albanese government are actively driving disillusioned voters directly away from Labour and, you guessed it, straight toward Pauline Hanson.
And that brings us to our last area, Section 5, the playbook comparison. Let's look at the strategic political calculus behind Labour's approach here.
And this brilliantly illustrates the contrasting strategies. The broadcast compares two very distinct Labour playbooks. First, you have Bill Shorten, who was completely upfront with voters about his intended tax changes on the top end of town. The result? Well, Australians revolted, and he lost what everyone dubbed the unlosable election. Then you have Anthony Albanese, who hid his true tax intentions until after the vote, and he won a decisive victory. The takeaway from commentators here is that Albanese took a very specific lesson from Shorten's defeat. Not that Australians don't want these changes, but rather, you kind of have to hide them until it's too late.
Which brings us to the number 94. The big question is, would Anthony Albanese have won 94 seats in a decisive election victory if he had been entirely honest with the Australian public about his tax intentions before the vote? The commentators assert that it's highly unlikely. And they really point out the irony of this coming from a leader who heralded a new era of trust in politics, a guy who promised his word was his bond. So, this leaves us with a final overarching question to ponder. With the Liberals facing an existential squeeze and Labour dealing with accusations of hidden agendas, are voters turning to flawed but clear conviction politicians like Pauline Hanson simply out of a profound lack of trust in the major parties? The case being made by the broadcast is that for a lot of Australians, despite her fallibility, Hanson represents an authenticity they feel is just completely missing from the mainstream right now. It's definitely a provocative thought, and it perfectly summarizes why we are seeing one nation coming fast in this shifting political landscape. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this explainer today. I hope it gave you a clear look into the dynamics currently squeezing Australian politics.